At 68, I became visible again in that Cleveland courtroom. For years, my own daughter looked through me like I was nothing but a faded shadow, an embarrassing reminder of humble beginnings she'd worked so hard to escape. But when I walked in that snowy February morning, something extraordinary happened. The judge froze mid-sentence, his face turning pale as death. "Is that her?" he whispered, and suddenly the entire courtroom fell silent. My trembling hands clutched an old letter in my worn purse, a letter I'd carried for decades like a tumor growing against my heart. It contained secrets that could destroy my daughter's carefully constructed life, expose her beloved father's true legacy, and change everything she believed about herself. I never wanted to use it. But as I watched her sitting there with her ambitious husband, both so confident in their polished armor of privilege, I realized some truths refuse to stay buried forever. What happens when a mother's love collides with the burden of truth? What price is too high for justice delayed? Follow this heartbreaking journey of family secrets, betrayal, and the courage to finally become visible after decades of silence. This is the story that will make you question what you would do to protect those you love, even from themselves. If this story touched your heart, please follow our channel for more powerful true stories. Like and comment to let us know where you're watching from and what you thought of Margaret's impossible choice. Sometimes the quietest voices carry the most devastating truths. I was 68 years old when I walked into that Cleveland courthouse. February's bitter cold cut through my bones, but nothing hurt more than the look on my own daughter's face, the way she rolled her eyes when I entered, as if my presence was something shameful, as if I was just an unwelcome shadow in her life. In that moment, I felt all those years of rejection come rushing back like a punch to my stomach. I remember adjusting my worn wool coat, the same one I'd worn to church for 15 years, as I shuffled to find a seat. The courtroom was packed with people in expensive suits, their leather briefcases gleaming under the fluorescent lights. I clutched my old handbag closer, feeling the outline of what was inside, something that could change everything. "All rise for the Honorable Judge William Montgomery," the bailiff announced. Everyone stood as the judge entered, his black robe flowing behind him. My daughter straightened her designer jacket and whispered something to her husband, that slick corporate attorney who'd never once bothered to remember my name at family gatherings. I watched her stand, tall and confident, so different from the little girl who once begged me to check under her bed for monsters. But then something unexpected happened, something that wasn't part of anyone's script that day. The judge had just started speaking, his authoritative voice filling the room, when his eyes landed on me. I was nobody, just an aging woman sitting in the back row of his courtroom. But when our eyes met, his voice faltered mid-sentence. His hand trembled slightly on the gavel. "Proceed with case number." His words trailed off as the color drained from his face. He squinted as if he couldn't believe what he was seeing. Then came the whisper, so quiet that only those nearest to him could hear. "Is that her?" Those 3 words rippled through the front row. The court reporter's fingers paused over her machine. The bailiff's posture stiffened. One by one, heads began to turn in my direction. Even my daughter, who had been determinedly ignoring my presence, slowly swiveled to look at me with confusion spreading across her face. The entire courtroom went silent. Not the respectful silence that follows a judge's entrance, but the heavy, expectant silence that falls when something monumental is about to happen. I could hear the ancient radiator hissing in the corner, the subtle creak of the wooden benches, the shallow breathing of strangers suddenly interested in an old woman they'd overlooked moments before. For the first time in years, I felt seen, truly seen, not as someone's mother or widow or burden, but as something else entirely, something powerful. My daughter's eyes widened. I recognized that look, the same one she'd given me when she was 16, and realized I knew about the boy she'd been sneaking out to meet. It was the look of someone suddenly understanding they'd underestimated you. "Your Honor," the prosecutor's voice broke the silence, uncertain. The judge cleared his throat, composing himself with visible effort. "My apologies, let's proceed." But his eyes kept drifting back to me, as if I were a ghost from his past he couldn't quite shake. I sat perfectly still, my arthritic hands folded over my purse. Inside was the letter, yellowed with age, its ink faded but still legible. A letter I'd carried for decades, unable to open it, unable to destroy it. A letter that connected me to this judge in ways my daughter couldn't possibly imagine. She had no idea who I really was. None of them did. All my life, I'd been dismissed. The quiet old lady who couldn't possibly have anything important to contribute. The mother-in-law whose opinions were tolerated but never valued. The widow whose grief was expected to be tidy and unobtrusive. Little did they know that the trial about to unfold would change everything. That the woman they'd been ignoring held the key to it all. That sometimes the most devastating truths come from the quietest corners. I felt a strange calm settle over me as I watched my daughter turn back to her expensive lawyer husband, whispering urgently in his ear. For 68 years, I'd kept my secrets. I'd swallowed my pride. I'd faded into the background for the sake of peace. But not today. Today, in this courtroom, I wasn't just a mother or a widow. I was the witness they never saw coming. In my worn leather purse, with its peeling edges and tarnished clasp, I carried an old letter. A letter written in the shaky handwriting of a man no longer alive. I'd kept it for decades, pressed between the pages of my Bible, like carrying a dead body strapped to my chest. That weathered envelope, sealed with faded wax, could save one life or completely destroy another. The courtroom's oak benches felt hard against my aging bones as I shifted uncomfortably. I could feel eyes on me, not just the judges, but others now. Curious glances darting my way when they thought I wouldn't notice. The whispers had started. Who was this old woman? Why did Judge Montgomery react that way? My daughter Charlotte sat 20 feet away, but the distance between us stretched across years of silence and disappointment. She was beautiful in her expensive navy-tailored suit, her honey blonde hair, just like her father's, pulled back into a sleek chignon. Her pearl earrings caught the light when she turned her head to confer with her husband Bradley. Those pearls were a gift from me on her wedding day, though she'd never acknowledged it. I watched her confident gestures, the way she commanded attention without even trying, and remembered a different Charlotte, a little girl with scraped knees and missing front teeth, who would crawl into my lap, sobbing after a nightmare, her small body trembling against mine. "Mommy, make the monsters go away," she'd plead, her tears soaking through my nightgown. Back then, I could still protect her. Back then, she still believed I could. Now she looked at me like I was the monster, an embarrassing relic, a reminder of the humble beginnings she'd worked so hard to escape. When our eyes briefly met across the courtroom, she quickly looked away, her lips tightening with annoyance. I saw her whisper something to Bradley, who glanced back at me with that patronizing smile he always wore when forced to acknowledge my existence. The weight of the letter seemed to grow heavier in my purse. My fingers absently traced its outline through the worn leather. Inside that envelope lay words that would shatter the carefully constructed image Charlotte had built of her father, the successful businessman, the community leader, the devoted family man who died too young. She had placed him on such a high pedestal that she couldn't see the cracks in his foundation. Or perhaps she simply chose not to. The prosecutor was presenting opening arguments, his voice fading in and out of my awareness as memories washed over me. I remembered the night Robert had given me the letter, his face ashen, hands trembling worse than they ever did. Even at the end, when the cancer had ravaged his body. "Margaret," he'd said, pressing the envelope into my hands, "promise me you'll keep this safe. Promise me you won't open it unless—" His voice had broken then, fear shadowing his eyes in a way I'd never seen before. "Unless there's no other choice." I'd promised, of course. After 32 years of marriage, I'd become an expert at keeping Robert's secrets, at smoothing over the rough edges of his life so Charlotte could see only the polished surface. Even after his death, I continued to protect his memory, swallowing my own truth like bitter medicine. Bradley was now approaching the bench, all confidence and expensive cologne. His law firm represented some of Cleveland's most powerful people, and he moved through the world with the easy assurance of someone who'd never known real hardship. He'd married Charlotte straight out of law school, dazzled by her beauty and ambition, and perhaps by the connections her father's name still carried in certain circles. What would happen to that name, to Charlotte's carefully cultivated life, if I opened that letter? If I revealed what Robert had confessed to me on his deathbed, his words slurred by morphine, but clear enough to haunt me for the last 15 years. I watched as my daughter leaned forward, hanging on her husband's every word, the elegant curve of her neck, the determined set of her jaw. These were gifts from me, though she'd never acknowledged that either. She'd rewritten her own history, painting herself as solely her father's daughter. There was no room in her narrative for the woman who had worked double shifts at the hospital to put her through college, who had ironed her graduation gown at midnight, who had held her through her first heartbreak. The bailiff walked past me, and I caught a whiff of his aftershave, the same brand Robert used to wear. My hand instinctively tightened around my purse. The letter inside felt like it was burning through the leather, through my skin, straight to my heart. I knew that if I showed that letter today, nothing in Charlotte's life would ever be the same. The carefully constructed identity she'd built would crumble like a house of cards. And deep down, I wasn't sure if I wanted to spare her that pain, or if I wanted her to finally taste the bitter dregs I'd been forced to swallow in silence for all these years. After decades of invisibility, of being pushed to the margins of my own daughter's life, part of me, a part I wasn't proud of, wanted her to know what it felt like to have everything you believed in questioned, to stand in the harsh light of truth and find no shadows to hide in. The judge called for a 15-minute recess, his gavel slamming down with a finality that made me flinch. As everyone rose and began to move about, I remained seated, my fingers still tracing the outline of secrets I'd kept buried for too long. Judge Montgomery couldn't hide it. His eyes kept finding me during every pause in the proceedings, like a compass needle drawn to north. His gaze would linger just a moment too long before he'd force himself to look away, shuffling papers he wasn't reading. I remembered him, though he probably assumed I wouldn't. Not as Judge William Montgomery, with his distinguished silver temples and black robes, but as Billy, a nervous law student with wire-rimmed glasses that kept sliding down his nose. 27 years ago, in the university library where I worked as a cleaning lady, he had been studying late one night. I had burst through the double doors, tears streaming down my face, mascara creating dark rivers on my cheeks. Robert had just confessed something terrible to me, the first of many confessions that would eventually fill that letter now nestled in my purse. Billy had looked up, startled by the intrusion into his quiet study space, and asked me to please keep it down. Then, seeing my distress, he'd awkwardly offered me a handkerchief with his university initials embroidered in the corner. "Ma'am, are you all right?" he'd asked, his voice cracking slightly. I had wiped my eyes, apologized, and retreated to the women's restroom to compose myself. When I emerged to continue my cleaning, he was gone, but he'd left a note. "Whatever it is, I hope it gets better." Such a simple kindness, but I'd kept that note for years, tucked into my wallet, a reminder that not everyone looked through me. Now here we were, decades later, on opposite sides of a mahogany bench, playing vastly different roles. But he knew. He had always known the letter existed. I had told him about it that night, in a moment of weakness, needing to unburden myself to someone, anyone, even a stranger studying for his bar exam. I watched him adjust his glasses, no longer wire-rimmed but expensive titanium frames, with the same nervous gesture from all those years ago. Some habits never change, even when everything else does. The courtroom doors opened and Charlotte returned with Bradley from the recess. She walked with the confident stride of a woman who had never known real hardship, at least not the kind that leaves permanent marks on your soul. Her cream silk blouse probably cost more than I made in a month at the nursing home where I'd worked until my arthritis forced me to retire. Her wedding ring caught the fluorescent light, the diamond so large it seemed to have its own gravitational pull. She had no idea. For her, I was just an embarrassing reminder of humble beginnings. The mother who spoke with a slight southern drawl she'd worked so hard to erase from her own speech, who still clipped coupons despite having enough in savings to live comfortably, who wore the same dress to every family event because it still fits just fine. Bradley leaned over and whispered something in her ear, his hand possessively resting on her lower back. I saw her smile in response, that practiced, perfect smile that never quite reached her eyes. The same smile she'd given me at Christmas 3 years ago, when I'd presented her with a handmade quilt that had taken me 8 months to complete. She'd thanked me politely before tucking it away in a guest room closet, where I suspected it remained untouched. The bailiff called the court back to order. As everyone settled into their seats, I noticed something I hadn't before, a slight tremor in Judge Montgomery's hand as he reached for his water glass. The same tremor I'd seen in Robert's hands when he was hiding something. "The prosecution may call its first witness," the judge announced, his voice steady, despite the trembling in his fingers. I watched as a parade of financial experts took the stand, using terms I barely understood: securities fraud, insider trading, fiduciary duty. This case involved the collapse of a large investment firm, and somehow my daughter and her husband were entangled in it. I hadn't followed the details closely. Charlotte never discussed her work with me, but I recognized the pattern, the same web of financial deception that Robert had woven decades ago, using other people's money to build castles in the air. Bradley seemed unconcerned, his expression one of mild boredom as he scribbled notes occasionally. He smiled reassuringly at Charlotte whenever she glanced his way, as if this were all a minor inconvenience soon to be resolved in their favor. The confidence of the privileged, of those who had never faced real consequences for their actions. Just like her father, the resemblance struck me suddenly painfully, not in her features, which were mostly mine, but in that particular tilt of her chin, the unwavering belief that the rules applied differently to her. Robert had worn that same expression the day he told me about his creative accounting practices, as if he expected me to admire his cleverness rather than recognize the fraud for what it was. The letter burned in my purse, its edges worn soft from years of my fingers tracing its outline, wondering if today would be the day I finally broke my promise to a dying man, a promise extracted not out of love but fear, his fear that the truth would tarnish the golden image he'd created for our daughter. And as I watched Judge Montgomery's eyes flicker towards me for the 5th time that morning, I realized that my presence alone was already causing cracks in that image. The truth was seeping through, even without a word from me. The young assistant prosecutor, a sharp-featured woman with intense eyes, was watching me too. There was something unsettlingly familiar about her, though I couldn't place it. She studied me with a focus that made me adjust my collar nervously, as if she could somehow see through my worn wool coat to the secrets I carried underneath. Charlotte still hadn't looked at me again. She sat rigidly in her chair, shoulders squared, eyes fixed on the proceedings as if her life depended on them. Perhaps it did, in ways she didn't yet understand. The letter in my purse seemed to grow heavier with each passing minute, like a stone pulling me down into depths I'd avoided for decades. The time for silence was running out. When they called for witnesses, I chose not to speak. Not yet. The courtroom was packed now. Journalists with their notepads, law students observing from the back, and curious onlookers drawn by the high-profile nature of the case. I settled into a hard wooden bench in the last row, my arthritis flaring in my hips despite the cushion I'd brought. The pain was familiar company these days, like an old friend who visits too often and stays too long. I watched as a financial analyst took the stand, a young man with nervous hands and a voice that gained confidence as he spoke about numbers and transactions. The jury listened intently, 7 women and 5 men, their faces revealing nothing as they absorbed testimony about shell companies and offshore accounts, terms that reminded me of late-night conversations I'd overheard between Robert and his business partners, whispered in our den when they thought I was asleep. But it wasn't the testimony that interested me most. It was the heavy weight of my silence that seemed to fill the room. They say the absence of sound can be louder than noise itself, and my silence, my deliberate choice not to speak when called, created a tension you could almost touch, like static electricity before a storm. Charlotte kept her back to me, her spine straight as a ruler, shoulders set with determination. But I could see the slight tremor in her hand when she reached for her water glass, the way she tucked a strand of hair behind her ear 3 times in 5 minutes. Nervous habits she'd had since childhood. She was avoiding looking at me, yet somehow hyper-aware of my presence. Judge Montgomery was no better. He kept his eyes fixed on the witness or his notes, deliberately averting his gaze from the back row where I sat. But each time he reached for his gavel, his fingers trembled almost imperceptibly. Twice he called for clarification on points that seemed perfectly clear, as if stalling, as if waiting for something or someone to intervene. The morning stretched on, the courtroom growing stuffy as the heating system worked overtime against the February chill. The window panes rattled slightly when a truck passed on the street outside. Someone coughed. Pages turned. Small sounds that filled the space between testimonies. I studied the jurors' faces, wondering what they saw when they looked at Charlotte and Bradley. Did they see the polished power couple with their perfect clothes and confident smiles? Or could they sense what lay beneath? The desperation, the secrets, the house of cards ready to collapse. Bradley leaned over to whisper in Charlotte's ear, his hand resting possessively on her arm. I watched her nod slightly, her profile sharp against the dark wood paneling behind her. She had my nose and chin, but her expressions, the slight furrow between her brows when she concentrated, the way her mouth tightened at the corners when she was controlling her emotions, those were all Robert's. Sometimes looking at her was like seeing ghosts. As the financial analyst stepped down, I noticed something new, a young woman sitting behind the prosecution table. She hadn't been there earlier, or perhaps I hadn't noticed her among the sea of dark suits. There was something about her that drew my attention, something in the intensity of her gaze as she studied documents spread before her, something in the careful precision of her movements. She looked up suddenly, as if sensing my scrutiny, and our eyes met across the crowded room. I felt a jolt of recognition, though I was certain we'd never met. She held my gaze for a long moment, her expression unreadable, before turning back to her papers. But throughout the rest of the morning, I caught her watching me from the corner of her eye, studying me with an interest that seemed more personal than professional. Later, during a brief recess, I overheard a conversation between 2 court officers standing near the water fountain. "That's Rachel Winters," one said quietly, nodding toward the young woman. "Assistant District Attorney. They say she specifically requested this case." "Ambitious," the other replied with a shrug. "These financial fraud cases can make careers." I watched as Rachel gathered her files, her movements efficient and purposeful. There was something familiar about the set of her shoulders, the slight tilt of her head as she conferred with the lead prosecutor. It nagged at me, like a half-remembered dream. When court reconvened, Charlotte finally turned in her seat, perhaps to scan the room for someone. Our eyes met, and for a brief moment I saw not the polished, distant woman she'd become, but my little girl, scared, uncertain, looking to me for reassurance. The moment passed quickly. Her expression hardened and she turned away, leaning to whisper something to Bradley that made him smirk. That smirk. It reminded me so much of the men who used to gather in our living room with Robert, smoking cigars and congratulating themselves on deals that I later learned had ruined lives. Bradley had the same look about him, the sleek confidence of someone who believed rules were for other people. I'd seen that expression on Robert's face the night before the FBI had come to our door 23 years ago. The letter in my purse seemed heavier than ever. I shifted in my seat, feeling its outline through the worn leather. For a moment I considered walking out, taking my secrets with me, letting Charlotte and her husband continue in their carefully constructed reality. It would be easier, quieter, the path of least resistance. But then Judge Montgomery looked directly at me for the first time since the initial shock of my arrival. His eyes held a question, almost a plea. and I knew that my silence, which had protected some, had hurt others. The truth hidden in that letter wasn't just mine to keep or reveal. It belonged to others too, people who had been waiting for justice for decades. As the afternoon session began, I made my decision. I would stay. I would watch. And when the moment was right, I would speak. Because sometimes the most powerful testimony comes from those everyone has forgotten were in the room. When the judge called for a 1-hour lunch recess, the courtroom emptied quickly. I remained seated, my arthritic knees protesting at the thought of navigating the crowded hallways. I'd packed a simple sandwich, egg salad on wheat bread, the edges already curling from sitting in my purse all morning. I wasn't hungry anyway. The knot in my stomach had been growing tighter with each passing hour. I watched as Charlotte and Bradley gathered their things, their heads bent close together in hurried conversation. She never once looked my way. They swept past my bench with Bradley's hand guiding her elbow, his Italian leather shoes clicking authoritatively against the marble floor. The sound echoed in the nearly empty room. Most of the spectators had filed out, seeking cafes and delis nearby. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting everyone who remained in a harsh, unflattering glow. I reached into my purse for a tissue, my fingers brushing against the letter. Always the letter, like a tumor I'd learned to live with. I was just about to stand when I felt a hand on my shoulder. The touch was light but firm, unexpected enough to make me flinch. I looked up to find Judge Montgomery standing beside me, his robes rustling softly. He had removed his glasses, and without them his eyes looked younger, more vulnerable, more like the Billy I'd met all those years ago. "Mrs. Pearson," he said quietly, "could I have a word with you? In my chambers." It wasn't really a question. His voice was low but carried that undeniable weight of authority. The few people still in the courtroom, a clerk organizing papers, a janitor emptying trash bins, pretended not to notice as I gathered my belongings and followed him. My heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird. His chambers were what you'd expect. Dark wood paneling, law books lining the walls, certificates in heavy frames. A desk that had probably witnessed decades of difficult decisions. The heat was turned up too high, and the air smelled of furniture polish and old paper. A half-eaten sandwich and an open bottle of antacids sat on a side table. Judge Montgomery closed the door behind us, then stood for a moment, his back to me, his shoulders rising and falling with a deep breath. When he turned, his expression was carefully composed, but I could see the strain around his eyes. "You know that letter can change everything," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Why have you never turned it in?" My throat felt suddenly dry. The directness of his question caught me off guard, though I should have expected it. I clutched my purse tighter, feeling the outline of the envelope inside. "You remember?" I said. It wasn't a question. He nodded slowly, moving to sit on the edge of his desk. "I remember a night in the university library, a cleaning woman in tears, a confession about her husband's business dealings, a letter she said would someday prove everything." He paused, studying me. "I was just a student then. I told you to take it to the authorities." "I couldn't," I whispered, the words scraping my throat. "Robert was dying by then. Charlotte was finishing college. The scandal would have destroyed her future. And now?" His eyes bore into mine. "What about the people who lost everything because of what your husband did? Don't they deserve justice?" I looked down at my worn shoes, unable to meet his gaze. The weight of 27 years of silence pressed down on me, making it hard to breathe. Through the small window behind his desk, I could see snowflakes beginning to fall, delicate and cold against the gray Cleveland sky. "She's my daughter," I said finally, my voice breaking on the words, "my only child." Judge Montgomery's face softened slightly. "I understand protecting family, Mrs. Pearson. But this case," he gestured vaguely toward the courtroom beyond his chambers. "It's not just about financial fraud. There are connections to what happened back then. Patterns repeating." My legs trembled beneath me and I reached for the nearest chair, lowering myself carefully. "Charlotte doesn't know," I said, "about what her father did, about the people who lost their homes, their savings. She was sheltered from it all. And her husband?" The judge's voice hardened. Bradley Whitfield comes from a family with old connections to your husband's former partners. Do you think that's coincidence? The room seemed to tilt slightly. I gripped the arms of the chair to steady myself. What are you saying? I'm saying history is repeating itself, he replied, his voice dropping even lower. And you might be the only person who can stop it. My heart pounded so hard, I was sure he could hear it. Images flashed through my mind, Robert begging me on his deathbed to keep his secrets, to protect his legacy for Charlotte's sake. The night FBI agents had come to our door while Charlotte was away at a sleepover, questioning Robert for hours in our living room while I sat frozen in the kitchen, a cup of cold tea clutched in my hands. The newspaper headlines that followed weeks later when several of his associates were arrested, while Robert somehow remained untouched, protected by his network of powerful friends. And now Charlotte, my beautiful, ambitious daughter, married to a man cut from the same cloth as her father. Was she complicit or another victim? The letter. Judge Montgomery's voice pulled me back to the present. What exactly does it contain? My legs found strength as indignation rose within me. If I were going to tell you that, I would have turned it in 27 years ago. He nodded, accepting this. Fair enough. He moved back behind his desk, suddenly looking every one of his 60-plus years. Mrs. Pearson, I can't tell you what to do, but I've spent my career watching people get away with crimes because those who could speak up chose silence, sometimes out of fear, sometimes out of love. He looked at me pointedly. But silence has consequences too. I stood, steadier now, as resolve began to replace uncertainty. I need to think. He nodded again. The court will reconvene in 20 minutes. As I turned to leave, my hand on the doorknob, he spoke once more. Margaret, the use of my first name stopped me. Whatever you decide, there will be fallout. Are you prepared for that? I didn't turn around. Are any of us ever truly prepared for the consequences of our actions, Judge Montgomery, or our inactions? I left without waiting for his answer, the door closing softly behind me. In the hallway, I leaned against the wall, my breath coming in short gasps. The image of my late husband flashed before me. Robert in his final days, his once robust frame withered by cancer, his eyes sunken but still burning with that peculiar intensity as he made me promise to keep his secrets. Why had I obeyed for so long? Out of love? Fear? Or simply the path of least resistance? As I made my way slowly back towards the courtroom, I caught sight of Charlotte and Bradley returning from lunch. She was laughing at something he said, her head tilted back, throat exposed, vulnerable in a way she never allowed herself to be around me. They looked like the perfect couple, successful, polished, untouchable, just like Robert and I had once appeared to the outside world. The letter burned in my purse like a live coal. For the first time in decades, I wondered if keeping my promise had been an act of love or cowardice. The afternoon session began with a different energy. People shifted in their seats, ties were loosened, and the earlier formality had given way to a tense anticipation. Outside, snow was falling more heavily now, casting a strange, muffled quality over the proceedings, as if we were all underwater. I returned to my seat in the back row, aware of glances thrown my way. Word had spread, whispers about the old woman who had rattled the unflappable Judge Montgomery. I sat with my hands folded over my purse, the letter inside burning like a hot coal against my lap. Rachel Winters, the assistant prosecutor, stood and approached the bench. Her navy suit was impeccably tailored, her dark hair pulled back in a severe bun that emphasized her sharp cheekbones. There was something almost predatory in her movements, deliberate, focused, with no wasted energy. Your Honor, she said, her voice clear and confident. The prosecution requests a brief pause to introduce new evidence that has just come to our attention. A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Bradley straightened in his chair, the casual smirk replaced by something more alert, more wary. Charlotte's shoulders tensed visibly beneath her cream silk blouse. Judge Montgomery's gaze flickered briefly to me before returning to Rachel. What evidence, Counselor? A witness statement and supporting documentation that directly relates to the formation of the shell companies in question. Rachel's voice remained steady, but I detected an undercurrent of excitement. We believe this evidence establishes a pattern of fraud dating back nearly 3 decades. Bradley was on his feet immediately. Objection, Your Honor. Any evidence not disclosed during discovery was unavailable until now. Rachel cut in smoothly. We only just confirmed its authenticity during the lunch recess. The judge held up his hand, silencing them both. I'll hear arguments from both sides in my chambers. His eyes scanned the room, settling briefly on me. Court will take a 15-minute recess. As the judge stood, Bradley leaned over to whisper something urgent to Charlotte. Her face paled, and for the first time that day, she turned fully in her seat to look directly at me. The naked fear in her eyes took me back 20 years, to the night she'd crashed her father's car and called me in tears, begging me not to tell him. The courtroom began to empty for the recess, but Rachel Winters made her way through the thinning crowd, moving with purpose in my direction. She stopped before my bench, her expression unreadable. "Mrs. Pearson," she said quietly, "would you come with me, please?" It wasn't really a request. I rose slowly, my joints protesting, and followed her from the courtroom. I could feel Charlotte's eyes boring into my back as we left. Rachel led me to a small conference room down the hall. Plain walls, a rectangular table, the buzz of fluorescent lights overhead. She closed the door behind us and turned to face me. "You have something that could help this case," she said without preamble. "Don't you?" I clutched my purse tighter. "I don't know what you're talking about." Her eyes, dark brown, almost black, studied me with uncomfortable intensity. 27 years ago, Robert Pearson was investigated for financial fraud involving the same network of investors that Bradley Whitfield now represents. Somehow your husband escaped prosecution while his partners went to prison. She took a step closer. "I think you know why." My breath caught in my throat. How could she possibly know about the letter? Judge Montgomery wouldn't have... "My father lost everything because of your husband's scheme," Rachel continued, her voice dropping to a near whisper. "Our home, his business, eventually, his will to live." And suddenly I understood why she looked so familiar. Those eyes, they were Thomas Winters' eyes. He had been one of Robert's closest business associates, one of the few who had gone to prison rather than cooperate with authorities. I remembered his wife bringing their young daughter to visit our home, years before the scandal broke. A serious little girl with solemn eyes, clutching a stuffed rabbit. "You're Thomas's daughter," I breathed. Something flickered across her face. Pain, quickly masked by professional detachment. I was 12 when they took our house. 15 when my father hanged himself in a rented apartment 3 months after his release from prison. Her voice remained steady, but her hands betrayed her, clenching and unclenching at her sides. He left a note saying he couldn't live with the shame. Shame. The word hung between us like a physical presence. I thought of Robert, who had somehow avoided that shame, who had died in our comfortable home surrounded by family, his reputation intact, who had made me promise to keep his secrets, to protect his legacy. I became a prosecutor to find justice for people like my father, Rachel continued, people who were ruined while others walked away clean. She leaned slightly forward. "Mrs. Pearson, whatever you're protecting, it's not worth it. Not anymore." My fingers traced the outline of the envelope through my purse, feeling the slight crinkle of the aging paper inside. For decades I'd carried this burden, believing I was protecting Charlotte. But what had I really protected? A lie. A carefully constructed facade that allowed the same patterns of destruction to continue into the next generation. "I'd like to see the judge," I said finally, my voice barely audible. Rachel nodded as if she'd expected this. "I'll take you to his chambers." As we stepped back into the hallway, I saw Charlotte and Bradley standing with their attorney near the water fountain. Charlotte's eyes widened when she saw me with Rachel. She broke away from the men and hurried toward us. "Mom!" Her voice rang out, sharp with alarm. It was the first time she'd spoken to me directly all day. "What are you doing?" I looked at my daughter, really looked at her. Behind the expensive clothes and perfect makeup, I saw fear. Not just concern or annoyance, but genuine fear. Did she know? Had she always known what her father had done? "Charlotte," I said, my voice steadier than I expected, "there are some things you need to hear. Things I should have told you long ago." "Mom, no!" The words escaped her in a desperate hiss. She glanced back at Bradley, who was watching us with narrowed eyes. "Whatever you think you're doing." I reached out and touched her cheek. She flinched slightly but didn't pull away. "I'm sorry," I whispered. Rachel gently took my elbow, guiding me past Charlotte toward the judge's chambers. As we walked away, I heard my daughter's voice, higher now, almost frantic. "Mom, don't!" Judge Montgomery was standing by the window when we entered, watching the snow fall. He turned, unsurprised to see us both. "Mrs. Pearson," he said softly, "have you made your decision?" I nodded, my hands trembling slightly as I opened my purse. The yellowed envelope seemed to glow against the dark interior, like a thing alive. The paper crackled softly as I withdrew it. This burden I'd carried for so long. The whole room went silent as I placed it on the desk. The handwriting on the front, Robert's once confident script, shaky from illness and medication, spelled out a simple instruction: to be opened only in the event of legal necessity. Judge Montgomery stared at the envelope, then at me. "Are you sure?" Before I could answer, the door burst open. Charlotte stood there, breathless, her perfect composure shattered. "Mom, please!" she cried, her voice breaking. "Don't do this!" The walls seemed to close in around us. Rachel, the judge, my daughter, all watching me as I stood, with my hand still resting on the letter that could destroy everything Charlotte believed about her father, about herself. And in that moment, for the first time in decades, I felt truly visible. Chaos erupted in the courtroom when we returned. Judge Montgomery held the unsealed letter in his hands, his face ashen as he read its contents. The bailiff had to call for order 3 times as whispers spread like wildfire. Charlotte sat frozen in her chair, her perfectly manicured nails digging into her palms so hard I could see tiny crescents of white forming in her skin. I felt strangely calm. After decades of carrying that burden, the release was almost physical, like putting down a heavy suitcase I'd been clutching for a cross-country journey. My shoulders actually felt lighter as I took my seat, not in the back row this time, but near the front where Rachel had guided me. Bradley kept glancing between Charlotte and me, his confident facade cracking with each passing minute. He leaned over to whisper something to their attorney, who shook his head in response, lips pressed into a grim line. The courtroom doors had been closed, Judge Montgomery's orders, and the tension in the room grew thick enough to touch. "The court has received new evidence," the judge announced, his voice steady, despite the slight tremor in his hands. "Evidence that not only pertains to the current case, but reveals a pattern of fraud dating back nearly 3 decades. A murmur rippled through the courtroom. I watched Charlotte's face, seeing the exact moment when understanding began to dawn, the slight widening of her eyes, the almost imperceptible parting of her lips. She turned slowly to look at me, and in her expression, I saw something I hadn't seen in years: recognition. She was finally seeing me, not as an embarrassing relic of her past, but as someone who had been present for everything, who had witnessed it all. "This letter," Judge Montgomery continued, holding up the yellowed envelope, "was written by Robert Pearson before his death 15 years ago. It contains a detailed confession of financial crimes committed between 1985 and 1998, including the manipulation of investment funds, creation of fraudulent shell companies, and deliberate misrepresentation to investors." The room went so quiet, you could hear the old radiator hissing in the corner. A pencil rolled off someone's notepad and clattered to the floor, the sound like a gunshot in the silence. "More significantly," the judge continued, "this confession names co-conspirators who were never charged, identifies accounts where embezzled funds were hidden, and—" Here he paused, his eyes briefly meeting mine before shifting to Charlotte, "establishes a direct connection to the financial structures at the center of our current case." Bradley was on his feet immediately. "Your Honor, I object to the introduction of this evidence. It's hearsay from a dead man with no way to verify." The letter includes account numbers, Mr. Whitfield. Judge Montgomery cut in sharply. Account numbers that match those found in your client's records. It also names your father-in-law as the architect of the fraud scheme that sent Thomas Winters and 3 others to federal prison, while he himself escaped prosecution. The name hung in the air like smoke. Thomas Winters. Rachel's father, the man who had hanged himself rather than live with the shame of what he'd been part of, or perhaps what he'd been framed for. Charlotte made a small, strangled sound. I watched her world collapsing in real time, the perfect image of her beloved father, the foundation upon which she'd built her entire identity, crumbling before her eyes. "That's not possible," she whispered, but there was no conviction in her voice. Just the hollow echo of someone watching certainty dissolve into questions. The letter in Judge Montgomery's hands wasn't just any confession. It was a detailed roadmap of Robert's crimes and a final act of self-protection. He had named others but minimized his own role. Classic Robert, even from the grave. But the accounts were there, the dates, the methods, all laid out in his increasingly shaky handwriting as the cancer medications made his once confident penmanship deteriorate page by page. In light of this evidence, the judge continued, this court has no choice but to order an immediate investigation into the connections between these past crimes and the current charges. Mr. Whitfield, the prosecution will be examining your relationship to Everest Holdings, which according to this letter was originally established by your late father-in-law as a vehicle for hiding fraudulently obtained assets. Bradley's face drained of color. I remembered him at Charlotte's college graduation, charming and ambitious, telling Robert how much he admired his business acumen. Had he known even then? Had he sought out my daughter because of her father's connections, his methods, his secrets? Your Honor, Bradley's attorney interjected, my client had no knowledge of any impropriety in his father-in-law's business dealings. These allegations are ancient history and have no bearing. The accounts are still active, Counselor, Rachel interrupted, her voice steady, but vibrating with barely controlled emotion. The methods are identical, and your client's signature appears on documents transferring funds from those very same accounts, established by Robert Pearson almost 30 years ago. The room erupted again. The judge gavelled for order, the sharp crack echoing off the wood-paneled walls. Through the commotion, my eyes remained fixed on Charlotte. Her perfect composure had shattered completely. Tears streaked her makeup, creating dark rivulets down her cheeks, just like mine had done that night in the library when a young law student named Billy Montgomery had offered me his handkerchief. "Mom," she mouthed across the room, the word barely audible. Not angry now, not dismissive, broken, confused, betrayed. I wanted to go to her, to explain that I'd kept the letter hidden to protect her, that I'd never intended for her to build her life on such a fragile foundation of lies. But it was too late for that now. The truth had escaped, wild and uncontrollable, like a bird finally freed from its cage. As the bailiff moved to clear the courtroom for an emergency conference between the judge and attorneys, I caught a glimpse of Rachel Winters. She stood perfectly still amid the chaos, watching Charlotte with an expression I couldn't quite read. Not triumph, not satisfaction, but something more complicated. The child who had lost everything watching the child who had unknowingly benefited from that loss. The symmetry of it struck me with physical force. 2 daughters, 2 fathers, one letter that had traveled across decades to finally connect them in this moment of reckoning. When they let us out, Charlotte didn't look at me again, but I knew that nothing would ever be the same between us. The careful distance she had maintained, the polite dismissal of my presence in her life, all of it had been built on a foundation that no longer existed. The truth had finally broken free, and with it, the last illusion that either of us could outrun the past. When it was all over, there were no applause, no victory, just tears. The final proceedings lasted until well after dark, the courtroom windows reflecting our images back at us against the night sky, like ghosts trapped in glass. Outside, snow continued to fall, covering Cleveland in a blanket of silent white that seemed to muffle even the city's heartbeat. The judge ordered a 30-day continuance for the prosecution to incorporate the new evidence. Bradley was placed under investigation, his passport surrendered, a monitoring device strapped to his ankle like an expensive, unwanted bracelet. His law firm issued a statement by evening. They were reviewing his employment status. Corporate speak for the axe that was already falling. The marble floors of the courthouse echoed with departing footsteps as attorneys packed briefcases. Court reporters gathered their equipment and spectators filed out, their faces alight with the delicious scandal they'd witnessed. The story would be in tomorrow's papers, on the evening news, whispered over dinner tables across the city. The prominent Whitfield family, the respected Pearson name, both tarnished now, smeared with the same brush that had once painted Thomas Winters as the lone villain of a scheme far larger than anyone had known. I sat alone on a hard bench in the corridor, my coat buttoned against the chill that seemed to emanate from the stone walls themselves. My arthritic fingers trembled slightly as I buttoned my worn gloves, preparing for the cold walk to the bus stop. The letter was gone now, entered into evidence, photocopied, analyzed, its secrets finally exposed to the light after decades in darkness. I felt hollow, emptied, like a vessel that had carried something poisonous for so long that its absence left me unsure of my own purpose. Had I done the right thing, the moral thing, or had I simply transferred my burden to my daughter's shoulders, crushing her beneath the weight of a truth she'd never asked to bear? Footsteps approached, quick, determined steps that I recognized before I even looked up. Charlotte stood before me, her designer coat unbuttoned, her scarf hanging unevenly as if hastily thrown on. Her makeup was smudged, her hair falling loose from its perfect chignon. She looked younger somehow, more vulnerable, stripped of the polished armor she usually wore. Why? The single word fell between us, heavy with all the questions behind it. Why had I kept the letter? Why had I revealed it now? Why had I let her build her life on a foundation of lies? I looked up at my daughter, this woman who shared my blood but had become almost a stranger to me, and found no easy answer. "I thought I was protecting you," I said finally, my voice barely audible in the empty hallway. "Your father made me promise." "My father?" she interrupted, her voice cracking on the word. "The father I thought was a respected businessman, a pillar of the community, the man I've spent my entire career trying to live up to." Her hands clenched at her sides. "Do you have any idea what you've done? What this means for me? For my reputation? For everything I've worked for?" I felt a flicker of the old defensiveness, the habit of making myself small in the face of her disappointment. But I pushed it away. "I know exactly what it means, Charlotte. It means the truth. Finally, after all these years." "The truth," she repeated, almost spitting the word. "The truth that my father was a criminal." "That my husband—" Her voice broke, and she pressed a hand to her mouth, stifling a sob. "Did you know about Bradley? That he was using the same accounts, the same methods?" I shook my head. "No, not until today." It was true. I'd suspected Bradley was cut from the same cloth as Robert, but I hadn't known the direct connection. Hadn't known he'd deliberately sought out Charlotte, married her to gain access to the financial structures Robert had left behind. "He told me he loved me," Charlotte whispered, and for a moment I saw not the accomplished lawyer but the little girl who'd come home crying after her first heartbreak at 16. Was that a lie too? Was everything a lie? I wanted to reach for her, to fold her into my arms as I had when she was small, but decades of distance held me back. "Not everything, Charlotte. Not the things that matter most." She laughed bitterly. "And what would those be, Mom? Please, enlighten me, because from where I'm standing, my entire life just went up in flames." A courthouse security guard passed, glancing curiously at us before continuing on his rounds. The building was nearly empty now, our voices echoing slightly in the marble corridor. "You built a career on your own merits," I said quietly. "Your intelligence, your work ethic, those aren't lies. Those are yours." "A career that will be destroyed by this scandal," she countered, running a hand through her disheveled hair. "No law firm will touch me now. No client will trust me." "Then you'll rebuild," I said simply. Just like I did after your father's first brush with the law, after we lost the house in Shaker Heights, after my name became something people whispered about at church. I met her eyes steadily. You're stronger than you know, Charlotte. You get that from me, not from him. Something flickered across her face. Surprise, perhaps, at this glimpse of steel in a mother she'd long dismissed as weak and irrelevant. For a moment I thought she might say something, might bridge the vast gulf between us. But then Bradley appeared at the end of the hallway, his face haggard, his attorney at his side. "Charlotte," he called, his voice echoing against the stone. "The car's waiting." She hesitated, caught between her husband and me, between the life she'd built and the truth that had finally caught up with her. I saw the struggle play out across her face, the uncertainty of which way to turn. "I have to go," she said finally, not meeting my eyes. I nodded, swallowing the disappointment that rose like bile in my throat. "I know." She turned to leave, taking 3 quick steps before pausing. Without looking back, she asked, "Did he ever really love me? My father?" The question hung in the air between us, fragile as a soap bubble. I thought of Robert, his flaws, his crimes, but also the nights he'd spent reading bedtime stories to Charlotte, the way he'd beamed with pride at her law school graduation, the tears in his eyes when he'd walked her down the aisle. "Yes," I answered truthfully. "He did. That wasn't a lie." She nodded once, a jerky motion, then continued down the hallway toward Bradley. I watched her go. This daughter who'd spent a lifetime pulling away from me, now walking into an uncertain future with the man who'd betrayed her trust as completely as her father had betrayed mine. I sat alone on that cold bench long after they'd gone, watching snowflakes dance outside the tall windows. The courthouse grew quiet around me, the last employees departing, security preparing to lock up for the night. I should have felt victorious, perhaps, vindicated. After all, the truth had finally come to light. Justice, long delayed, was finally finding its path. But there was no triumph in watching my daughter's world crumble, in seeing her face as she realized that her foundation was built on quicksand. No satisfaction in knowing that Rachel Winters might finally have closure for her father's death, but at the cost of my own daughter's suffering. When I finally rose to leave, my joints stiff with cold and age, I felt a strange peace settling over me. Not happiness, certainly, but the quiet certainty that comes from finally setting down a burden carried too long. Outside, the snow had transformed Cleveland into something softer, more forgiving. I stood on the courthouse steps, my breath forming clouds in the frigid air, and turned my face up to the falling flakes. They melted against my skin like tears. I had learned over my 68 years that truth is rarely clean or simple, that justice doesn't always heal the wounds it addresses, that sometimes the greatest act of love is not protection, but honesty, however painful. As I made my way carefully down the snow-covered steps, I whispered into the winter night, "I am not invisible. I was the witness." And somewhere in the darkness, I thought I heard an answering whisper, the voice of a young law student, an aging judge, a man who had finally seen me after all these years. "Yes, you were." As Margaret's story comes to a close, I'm left wondering, how many of us carry secrets like yellowed letters in our worn purses, thinking we're protecting those we love? Sometimes, what we hide in the name of protection becomes the very thing that prevents genuine healing. It took Margaret 68 years to realize that invisibility was not her shield, but her prison. What would you have done in Margaret's position? Would you have maintained the comfortable lie that allowed your child to prosper, or revealed a devastating truth that might destroy their world but finally set you free? The hardest love is not always the kind that shelters, but sometimes the kind that exposes, that brings painful truths into the light where they can finally be faced and, perhaps someday, forgiven. If this story touched something deep within you, please take a moment to like, share, and subscribe to our channel for more powerful stories of human courage and redemption. Every one of us has moments when we must choose between comfortable silence and difficult truth. Margaret chose to finally be seen, to stand as a witness to what really happened. And in doing so, she reminds us that it's never too late to reclaim your voice, to step out of the shadows and into the person you were always meant to be.